This is the Cash Car Convert Podcast, Episode 1.
You're listening to the Cash Car Convert Podcast with James Kinson.
Hello and welcome. My name is James Kinson, and I am the Cash Car Convert. Welcome to my podcast. This is the podcast where cash cars are cool and auto debt is dangerous to your financial future. I want to welcome you again to the show. I really appreciate you taking the time to listen. I know there are a lot of podcasts out there, and I hope that this one will be educational and beneficial to you. In this initial episode, I want to start by talking a bit about who I am, how I came to be a cash car convert, and then a bit about the podcast and what I hope that people will get out of it and where I plan to go with it. My first car I purchased for cash, probably like you did. And I didn't do it because I had some strong feeling about cash cars at that time. It was strictly because I couldn't get credit. But as soon as I had my first real job, I did start to want to purchase cars on credit. And this was driven in large part by the people I worked with. I worked for a very large company. There were a lot of very successful business professionals that I worked with. I happened to be a newbie in an environment where most of the people had, 20 plus years in the business, so they were well established. And I remember sitting at times in their offices and listening to them talk to their bankers when they would want to buy a car, and they had such easy access to credit. And I was really in awe of that, envious in fact. The other thing I noticed about them is they tended to buy new cars. And I didn't, even though I liked the idea of new cars, and I certainly like driving new cars, I never really could make that mental leap myself to drive a new car. So other than one new car I bought very early in my life, for myself personally, I've always purchased used. I have purchased a couple of new cars for a spouse, but in general, I've been a used car buyer. And in fact, over the 40 years of my car buying, I've purchased 20 cars. I've always bought and sold cars myself. I have never traded a car in. I may at times say or make reference to a trade-in or changing a car, but just know that that was always me buying another car and then selling that one because I've never traded in, even though I've tried to on occasion, but I was just never happy enough with the price to take that financial hit, so I always wound up selling it myself. But getting back to the story of these gentlemen and their ability to buy cars with credit and new cars and doing it quite easily, I really wanted to be like those guys. I felt certain that these people were very successful financially. I mean, look how easy they could buy a car, and a new car at that. And I wanted to be like them. So I did eventually get there. I established myself with the credit union. I had my job and it was secure, and therefore I had access to credit. Now, again, I never did buy the new cars, but I started buying used cars, and the thing I found was that I would buy a car and I would be really happy with it. And I would drive it for 6 months, 12 months, and I would notice that, as much as I enjoyed this car when I first bought it, after driving it for a while, it was just another car. And I would start to look at it differently and be more disgruntled with the little things that might be going on with it, or, if it burned too much gas, or if I had to replace the tires, or whatever was going on, it was just that much more of a hassle. And the thing that I found is no matter whether I loved the car or whether I was ready to sell that car and buy something else, I always had the car payments. The car payments were a constant. They were always there. And you fast forward in my life, in 2009, I discovered a book by Dave Ramsey called The Total Money Makeover. And when I discovered this book, my wife and I were $70,000 in credit card debt. And on top of that, we had 2 cars with payments totaling $500 a month, or right at. Because see, I was really smart. So I decided I was going to keep my car payments under $300. So I would put down enough money on a car to make sure that my payment wasn't over $300 a month. For whatever reason, for me mentally, I just couldn't make myself make a payment over $300 a month. So that was where we found ourselves, though. Despite feeling how smart I was about my car payments, I was still $70,000 in credit card debt. And so I read this book, and it really changed my perspective, The Total Money Makeover. And I asked my wife to read it as well, and she was gracious enough to read it. And after she read it, we agreed that we needed to change our lives And we paid off all of our credit card debt, and we paid off our cars, and we actually sold both of those cars and subsequently bought two different vehicles, and we paid cash for those cars. And the only debt we have right now is on some real estate that we own. So other than that, we're debt-free, and we plan to stay that way. In fact, for those of you who are Dave Ramsey aficionados, the other thing that we have is about an 8-month emergency fund to make sure that we can get through any bumps in the road that come along. So you listen and you say, okay, that's great, James, but what does that have to do with why you have a Cash Car Convert podcast, and why did you become a Cash Car Convert? Well, I became a Cash Car Convert because of what the Total Money Makeover taught me. But I actually learned that lesson earlier and had just forgotten it. I went through a kind of a rough period in my life, and I was driving a Lexus LS400, and I needed to get out from underneath that car, and I couldn't do it. So I had to keep that car longer than I wanted to, and when I was finally able to sell it, I had a friend who told me, hey, I know somebody who's selling a car. It's a really good car. It's a couple of grand, and it's a little quirky, but it's mechanically good. So I checked the car out and found that it was, in fact, a really good car. And this was back in the late 90s, and this car was a 1987 Saab. This car was really clean inside and out. It did run really well, but it was also kind of quirky. Some of the electronics on it kind of worked when they wanted to and so forth. But this was a really great car for me. And the funny thing is after having had car payments that I didn't want and didn't need, driving this cash car, I just remember feeling smarter when I drove it. And I drove that car for probably 2 years, and eventually it was time for that car to go, and we donated it to a charity. But when I got rid of that vehicle, I wound up not staying in the cash car area. As smart as I felt when I drove that, I didn't have that life-changing epiphany at that point in time. And so I went right back into the debt of my next vehicle. And that's how I wound up in 2009 finding myself $70,000 in credit card debt and, with car payments of nearly $500 a month. So I'm listening to Dave's Total Money Makeover book, and I start listening to his radio show. And the one thing that's a reoccurring theme on his show, I notice, is that he tells people to sell their cars. In fact, he will sometimes say, I sometimes feel like this is the sell the car show. And he doesn't just tell them to sell the car. He has a very specific phrase that if you listen to his show, you will hear it repeated. And that is, sell the car, buy a beater. Sell the car, buy a beater. So I'm listening to this and I'm thinking about it, and I notice that Dave doesn't tell people how to buy a beater. And I remember being in debt, and I remember how that feels. And I had this feeling that a lot of people might not take Dave's actions because they were scared. And there's not a lot of good information out there. I searched on the web. I could not find a lot of good information out there about how to buy cheap used cars, inexpensive used cars, under $5,000. I knew that I had the capability to help people in this area. And I started thinking about it. And I started trying to figure out how I could help people. I really struggled with this for quite a while. I thought about a buying service. I thought about a consulting service. And really, I thought, for people buying cars under $5,000, none of that really makes much sense. So for probably 2 years, I didn't do anything with this other than listen and kind of noodle on it, and it never really went anywhere. Well, about a year ago, my wife and I were visiting family. Two of the young men in that family had purchased cash cars, and neither of them were working. And I'm listening to this story. I'm seeing these guys struggling getting back and forth to work. And the only thing I could think of was, I wish they had called me. I could have helped them. And after that family visit was over, as I was driving home, it really, I guess I had an epiphany. It dawned on me that I really needed to do something for people in that position. And since I couldn't consult with everybody, I thought that the next best thing I could do is to write a book. So I told my wife I was going to write a book. And she thought that was a great idea, which made me very happy because my wife's a really smart lady. And so if she thinks I'm doing something right, then it makes me feel like, I probably am. So I started thinking about how I could write a book. And I've never been a writer, so I didn't really know where to start. And I started hearing some people say, the best way to write a book is to do a blog and then consolidate your blog posts into a book. And I thought, writing a book is a pretty daunting idea for me, but writing a blog, that doesn't seem as daunting. I can break down specific pieces of the buying process and try to point people to places on the web where they can do research and give them information about how I use those resources. And I thought, I think I can do that. I think that's doable. So I decided I was going to launch a blog, and in August of 2013, I did in fact launch the Cash Car Convert blog, and you can find that at cashcarconvert.com. As of this recording, I've been posting for about 3 months. But as I was going through this process of wanting to start a blog, I started listening to a lot of podcasts. And I started initially listening to Dave Ramsey's podcast. But as I listened to Dave Ramsey's podcasts of his radio show, I started hearing him interview other people. And these other people had podcasts, so I started listening to those podcasts. So I started listening to people like Michael Hyatt and Dan Miller. And from those guys, I was introduced to people like Cliff Ravenscraft and Pat Flynn and Ray Edwards. So all of these people became mentors to me through their podcasting. And what I found is I rarely have time to read blogs, but I can easily find time to listen to a podcast. So I decided that I needed to create a podcast around the idea of being a cash car convert. And that's how I came to be creating this podcast. So I've kind of given you the background on me and how I came to this place. Now let me tell you a little bit about what I'd like to achieve with this podcast. The first thing I want to do is to provide education. So first I can talk about my own experiences and give you what James would do in a specific instance to buy a car and how I would go about it. The other thing I can do is help with pointing you to resources that have served me well. I mentioned that the internet is full of these resources. So I hope to be doing interviews with companies like Edmunds.com, Carfax, Auto Trader, Kelley Blue Book, and others, AAA. I'd like to bring some of these resources to bear and help people understand how to utilize these resources and that they're there in the first place. I think a lot of people, they just drive to a dealership and they buy a car, and I don't think that there's as much research goes into it these days as there should be. And I think one thing that's critical for anybody to understand is the less money you're going to spend on a car, the more research you need to do before you buy. Because if you're in a place where you don't have margin in your life, a car buying mistake can be very expensive to you. And there's two things that I really want to make sure in this podcast and when people buy using, what I'm trying to teach them here is I don't want you to be hit with that huge mechanics bill. That's the first thing. The second thing is I don't want you, your wife, or your kids stranded with a car that's not running because that you bought a cheap car. My intent here is to help you buy a better beater, if I'm going to use Dave Ramsey's terminology here. And if you can buy a better beater, then that car can be a blessing and not a curse to you and your family. And that's really the ultimate goal here. And that's the education portion of that, I think, is going to be helpful. Again, whether that's my experiences or pointing you to resources on the web. The second thing I want to do is I want to inspire you to understand that there are people out there today who are very successful. And one of the reasons they're successful is because they made decisions in their financial life to not make things like cars their priority. And some of them may have in the past, but they eventually came around, like myself, to this feeling that cars, they're great, but really they're transportation, they're a tool. And the car I drive doesn't really define me. A lot of us seem to think that they do, but they don't. If you're driving a Mercedes or a VW or a Toyota, nobody knows if you're a millionaire or not. They may make assumptions, but as Dr. Thomas Stanley's book, The Millionaire Next Door, showed us, those assumptions can be wrong. And I would be remiss not to say at this point that Dr. Thomas Stanley is also another person who influenced me greatly. I've read all of his books, and I would encourage you to do the same. The Millionaire Next Door, The Millionaire Mind, and Stop Acting Rich and Start Acting Like a Real Millionaire. Those are all fantastic books and must-reads, I think. So going back to the people I want to interview on this podcast, apart from the educational resources available on the web, I want to interview people who are successful now, and part of the reason they're successful is because they were able to take risks because they had margin in their life. When you have debt loaded up on you, you feel trapped, and rightly so, because that's really where you are. It's not a great place to be. I've been there on multiple occasions in my life, and I don't plan on going back. And the reason I don't plan on going back is because I know that if I can live without debt, then I have more opportunities in my life. My income is the number one thing that helps me drive. It's my number one source of wealth. And if I'm using it to buy cars or using credit to buy things like cars or eating out at restaurants, buying clothes, then I'm leaving money on the table. I'm not investing in my future. I'm investing in the future of someone else. And again, I want to bring you interviews from people who've broken that code and figured out that they want to start a business. Well, guess what? You can do that if you're debt-free, but you can't do that if you're loaded down with debt. So I want to bring you some people that are successful. And as this podcast goes on and I meet more cash car converts out there, I'll also have some everyday folks who have built wealth simply because they've been very smart with their financial life. They were smart with their income. They spent it on savings, on their children's education. They spent it on tithing to the church or giving to charity. And they didn't spend it on cars that depreciate 50% in 4 years. They didn't, spend it on clothes or eating out at restaurants. So this isn't necessarily, being a cash car convert isn't necessarily an easy path, but I think the benefits much outweigh any short-term pain that's associated with it. So my goal here is to take away the inhibitors to you becoming a cash car convert. I believe that if you can become a cash car convert and kick auto debt to the curb, it's the one decision that can change your life. If you can do that, you will be able to send your children to college. If you will do that, you will be able to start or add to your retirement. If you can do that, then you will be able to give to your church or to your favorite charity. And best of all, you'll have more margin in your life. If something does happen and you lose your job, you may have some things to worry about, but one of them won't be whether somebody's coming to get your car in a month or not. You may have to figure out how to put gas in it, but you're going to have a car to hunt for work. So again, all about giving you additional margin in your life. So this is going to wrap up this initial episode. I hope you've enjoyed learning a little bit about me and a little bit about what I hope to accomplish in this podcast. And I'm going to tell you also at this point that it is my intent that this podcast is going to be, especially when I'm talking in more of a monologue, it's going to be very conversational. I don't intend to do a lot of editing. I want this to be just me talking like I would to a friend and like I have to friends about the way I feel about cash cars. And I hope that many of you out there will become my friend as we go through this journey and you become a cash car convert. So I'm going to ask if you could, feel free to go visit my blog, read some of my previous posts, find out what I'm about. Also, if you would, I would sure love it if you would go leave a review in iTunes. Any review is going to be appreciated. I want feedback. I want to know what's good and what's bad on this podcast. But I will say that 5-star reviews will help me to be noticed on iTunes and keep me up there in the rankings where people can find me. And I believe I have a really important message to deliver. So with that, I'll end this episode, and thank you for your time.
Hey, you still here? That's great. Listen, I've got something to tell you. I've got a great interview with Pat Flynn coming up in the next episode, and I just got to tell you, he rocked it. And some of you may or may not know who Pat Flynn is. For those who do know him, you're definitely going to want to come back and hear this interview. I've heard a lot of interviews with Pat, but never one like this. I ask him questions I've never heard him asked on any other show, and I think you're going to want to hear it. If you don't know who Pat Flynn is, you're definitely going to want to come back because you're going to want to know why somebody who makes right at $60,000 a month is still driving a 2003 Honda CR-V. Have a great week, and remember, drive a cash car and kick auto debt to the curb. This is James Kinson. Until the next episode, may God bless you.